The year 1818 drew its final ragged breaths in a shroud of Northumbrian mist. At Ravensdale, the autumn had not been a season of mellow fruitfulness, but one of slow, encroaching chill. The stone of the great house seemed to have absorbed the grey of the sky, the damp of the fells, and the silence of its master. It was a place that felt less like a home and more like a monument, holding its breath against the coming winter. The woods that clung to the estate's edges were skeletal, their leaves long since surrendered to the wind, leaving a tangled lattice of black branches against a pewter sky. The air itself was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of wet earth and cold stone. It was a landscape of muted colours, the deep, bruised purple of the distant moors, the tired olive of the parkland grass, the slick, dark grey of the carriage drive. Ravensdale was not a house that sat upon the land. It was a house that had been wrestled from it, and the land had never quite forgiven the intrusion. Into this silence and stillness, a carriage arrived, its wheels crunching on the gravel, with a sound that felt like a violation. It was not a grand carriage, but a sturdy, serviceable thing, its paint faded and its leather worn. It carried Miss Helena Withorpe, and the entirety of her worldly possessions packed into two modest trunks. Helena looked out of the window as the house resolved itself from the mist. It was immense, a severe block of Palladian architecture that offered no welcome. Its many windows were like vacant eyes, dark and unblinking. She felt a tremor of something cold and heavy settle deep in her stomach. It was not fear, precisely. She had lived with fear for so long, it had become a dull, familiar ache. This was something else. The feeling of arriving at the end of a long, final road. The contract had been signed 3 weeks prior in her father's solicitor's office in York. A cramped, dusty room that smelled of paper and despair. The Duke of Blackwood had not been present. His man of business, a Mr. Hargrove, had handled the particulars with a brisk, bloodless efficiency. The terms were simple. In exchange for the hand of Miss Helena Withorpe in marriage, the Duke would settle her father's catastrophic debts, ensuring he and her mother would not see the inside of a debtor's prison. It was a transaction, a life for a life, her freedom for theirs. Her father had wept. Her mother had not. Her mother had looked at her with a kind of desperate, hungry gratitude that was far worse than tears. Helena had felt nothing at all. She had learned, over the past year of mounting panic and quiet privations, to build a wall inside herself. Behind it, she kept the girl who had once dreamed of a love match, of a small manor with a rose garden, of a life chosen rather than dictated. That girl was a luxury she could no longer afford. The carriage door opened. A footman, his face impassive, lowered the steps. Helena gathered her grey wool cloak around her and descended, her feet landing on the gravel of her new home. Her new prison. The air was colder out here, and she drew it into her lungs, a sharp, cleansing sting. She did not look back at the carriage. She looked forward, at the massive oak doors of Ravensdale. The doors opened before she reached them, swung inward by a butler who looked as ancient and weathered as the house itself. He was tall and thin, his spine bent into a permanent, questioning curve. "Miss Withorpe," he said. His voice was a dry rustle, like dead leaves skittering across flagstones. "His Grace is expecting you. I am Hemlock." He did not smile. No one, it seemed, smiled at Ravensdale. She followed him into the great hall. It was a cavern of shadow and cold. A vast black and white marble floor stretched into the gloom, its checkerboard pattern dizzying. High above, the vaulted ceiling was lost in darkness. A fire struggled for life in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, its meagre flames doing little to combat the profound chill of the hall. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, and something else, something like old grief. A man was standing by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantel. He turned as she entered. The Duke of Blackwood. He was taller than she had expected, and leaner. He was dressed entirely in black, from his polished boots to the severe cut of his coat, and the dark silk of his cravat. It was not mourning dress, not precisely, but the absolute absence of colour was a statement in itself. His hair was as black as his coat, raven black, and his face was a collection of sharp, aristocratic angles. A strong jaw, a straight nose, a mouth that was a thin, unyielding line. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the colour of the sea on a stormy day. A turbulent, restless grey that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. He was 32 years old, and he looked both older and younger. Older in the weary set of his shoulders, younger in the raw, unguarded pain that flickered for a moment in his eyes before being extinguished. He inclined his head. A fractional movement. Miss Witthorpe. His voice was a low baritone, as devoid of warmth as the rest of him. Your Grace, she replied, her own voice steady. She would not be intimidated. She had sold her life, but not her dignity. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, amplified by the echoing emptiness of the hall. He made no move to come closer, to take her hand, to offer any word of welcome. He simply watched her, his sea-grey eyes assessing her, as one might assess a new piece of livestock. She bore his scrutiny without flinching, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze level. She was wearing her best travelling dress, a practical gown of dark grey merino, refitted twice. It was clean and neat, but she was acutely aware of its plainness in this grand, cold place. She was a grey wren in a cage of eagles. Hemlock will show you to your rooms, the Duke said at last, turning his attention back to the fire. Dinner is at 8. It was a dismissal. She had been received, inspected, and now put away. She gave a small, formal curtsy. Thank you, Your Grace. He did not reply. He did not turn again. Helena followed the butler up the grand staircase, her footsteps and the tap of his staff the only sounds. The chill seemed to deepen as they ascended. Portraits of long-dead ancestors watched them pass, their painted eyes cold and critical. They all had the Duke's dark hair and sharp features. They were the Blackwoods of Ravensdale, and she was an intruder, a Whitthorpe of nowhere. Her rooms were in the east wing, a suite, comprising a sitting room and a bedroom, both vast and opulent. A fire had been lit in the sitting room, but like the one downstairs, it seemed cowed by the scale of the chamber. The furniture was heavy and dark, shrouded in dust covers. Her Grace's rooms have been prepared, Hemlock stated, gesturing to the closed door of the bedroom. A maid, Agnes, has been assigned to you. She will be up shortly to assist you. Her Grace. The title sounded absurd. She was Helena Witthorpe. She would always be Helena Witthorpe. The Duchess of Blackwood was a role she was to play, a costume she was to wear. Thank you, Hemlock, she said. He gave a stiff, shallow bow and departed, his footsteps receding down the long, silent corridor. The silence he left behind was heavier than his presence. Alone, Helena walked to the tall window and looked out. The view was of a formal garden, its geometric beds bare and brown, its statues stained with green. Beyond the garden wall, the parkland rolled away into the mist. It was a bleak, unforgiving vista. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were a waste of energy, an indulgence. Instead, she unpinned her bonnet and set it on a chair. She smoothed her dark auburn hair, tucking a stray strand back into the simple knot at the nape of her neck. She was here. The contract was fulfilled. Her family was safe. This was the price. She would endure it. She had always been good at enduring. Dinner was an exercise in silent misery. The dining room was another magnificent, heartless space, its walls covered in dark, faded tapestries depicting brutal hunting scenes. A long, polished mahogany table stretched for what felt like miles, set for two at opposite ends. The Duke and his new Duchess. They were two small, solitary islands in a vast, dark sea. The Duke did not speak. He ate with a remote, mechanical precision, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. Helena ate what was put before her, the food tasteless in her mouth. The only sounds were the clink of silver on porcelain and the soft, ghostly movements of the footman. The silence was not peaceful. It was a living thing, a pressure that pressed in on her, making it difficult to breathe. It was filled with everything that was not being said. She studied him from her distant outpost. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hand clenched around his wine glass. He was a man locked in a fortress of his own making. The reports had said his younger brother, Edward, had died 6 months ago. A fall from a horse here on the estate. The Duke had been inscrutable before, they said, but since the death he had become a recluse, a ghost in his own home. He had needed a wife to secure the succession, an heir for the Blackwood line. But he had not wanted a companion. He had wanted a functionary, a womb. The thought sent another shiver of cold through her, a cold that had nothing to do with the draughty room. After the meal, which she could not wait to end, he rose. "I have work in my study," he said, the first words he had spoken in over an hour. "You may retire or use the drawing room as you see fit." He did not wait for a response. He simply turned and left her there, alone at the vast, empty table. Helena did not go to the drawing room. She went back to her rooms. The maid Agnes, a young girl with frightened rabbit eyes, had unpacked her trunks. Her few simple gowns looked forlorn and out of place in the cavernous wardrobe. The days that followed fell into a rigid, silent pattern. Breakfast, a solitary affair, in a small, cheerless morning room. Hours spent in her rooms, or wandering the cold, echoing corridors of the house, feeling more like a spectre than a resident. Lunch, alone again. Dinner, another silent ordeal at opposite ends of the world. The Duke was a phantom. She would catch glimpses of him crossing the hall, or riding out towards the fells. A dark figure on a dark horse, moving fast, as if to outrun something only he could see. He never spoke to her beyond a curt nod or a formal "Your Grace," if they happened to pass in a corridor. She was utterly, completely alone. But Helena was not one to succumb to despair. It was not in her nature. She was a practical creature, and she knew she must find a way to live in this gilded cage. She could not change the Duke. She could not warm the house. But she could find a small corner of this world for herself. On the fourth day, restless and suffocated by the oppressive interiors, she pulled on her sturdiest boots and her cloak, and went outside. She bypassed the dead formal gardens and walked towards the parkland, following a path that led towards the stables and the distant fells. The air, though cold, was a relief. The sheer scale of the landscape was daunting, but it was honest. It did not pretend to be something it was not. She walked for nearly an hour, her mind blessedly empty, focusing only on the rhythm of her feet on the damp earth and the feel of the wind on her face. It was on her way back that she saw him. In a large, stone-walled paddock, far from the main stable block, was a horse, a stallion. He was the colour of midnight, a magnificent creature of muscle and fire, his coat gleaming like polished jet even in the flat grey light. He moved with a restless, explosive energy, circling the enclosure, his head high, his tail flagged. His nostrils flared, plumes of steam jetting into the cold air. Two grooms stood by the fence, watching him with wary expressions. As she drew closer, the stallion threw his head up, let out a piercing, challenging neigh, and reared, his front hooves pawing at the sky. He was terrifying and beautiful, a being of pure, untamed spirit. "Best keep your distance, Your Grace," one of the grooms called out to her, his voice strained. "That's chaos. No one goes near him." "Chaos?" she asked, stopping a safe distance from the wall. "Aye, that was Mr. Edward's horse," the groom supplied. "The Duke's brother. Been half mad since the accident. Vicious he is. We can barely get in to feed him." Helena watched the stallion. He was not vicious. She had grown up in the country, had been around horses all her life. She saw past the wild posturing, the bared teeth, the lashing tail. She saw the fear. His eyes were wide, rolling, showing the whites. His muscles were coiled tight, not with aggression, but with a profound, inconsolable agitation. He was grieving. She felt a strange pang of kinship with the creature. A wild, broken thing, locked away in a cold, lonely place. She stayed there for a long time, just watching. The grooms eventually gave up and retreated to the warmth of the stables, leaving her alone with the wild horse she did not try to approach. She simply stood by the stone wall, her arms resting on the cold, moss-dusted top. She did not speak. She just watched, her presence quiet and undemanding. After a time, the stallion's frantic pacing began to slow. He stopped his circling and stood in the center of the paddock, his head still high, watching her. His ears were pricked, his whole body tense, but the frantic energy had subsided. He was observing her as she had been observing him. She came back the next day, and the day after that. It became her ritual, her escape. Every afternoon, she would walk to the far paddock and stand by the wall. She brought a book sometimes, but she rarely read it. She simply stood, a quiet, still point in the bleak landscape. Chaos began to expect her. He would still greet her with a show of wildness, a toss of his head, a snort, but it was becoming a performance, a ritual between them. The fear in his eyes was slowly being replaced by curiosity. He would watch her for the duration of her visit, and sometimes he would take a few steps closer to the wall before stopping, as if remembering he was supposed to be untamable. On the 7th day of her vigil, something shifted. It was colder than usual, a bitter wind sweeping down from the fells. Helena pulled her cloak tighter, her fingers numb as she rested them on the stone wall. Chaos was standing near the center of the paddock, his back to the wind, his head low. He looked dejected, a portrait of loneliness. Without thinking, she began to hum, a soft, simple tune her mother used to sing to her when she was a child. It was a wordless melody, a gentle, lilting air that held no demands, only a quiet comfort. The stallion's head came up. His ears swiveled towards her, catching the sound. He turned to face her fully. For a long moment, he was utterly still. Then, slowly, deliberately, he began to walk towards her. He did not charge. He did not posture. He moved with a soft, cautious tread, his eyes fixed on her face. He stopped directly in front of her, separated only by the wall. He was immense up close, his power a palpable presence. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, see the intelligence in his dark, liquid eyes. Her humming faltered and stopped. Her heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. He lowered his head. Slowly, gracefully, he dipped his magnificent head until his muzzle was level with her hands, resting on the wall. He blew out a soft, warm breath that ghosted over her frozen fingers. It was a gesture of absolute trust, an offering. Helena felt a crack appear in the wall she had built around her own heart. A warmth spread through her chest, sharp and painful and wonderful. She reached out a hesitant hand and laid it gently on the soft space between his nostrils. His skin was like velvet. He did not flinch. He leaned into her touch, a low nicker rumbling in his chest. She was so lost in the moment, in this first fragile connection, that she did not hear the footsteps behind her. "What in God's name do you think you are doing?" The voice was like a whip crack, cold and sharp. Helena snatched her hand back, as if burned. Chaos threw his head up, startled by the harsh sound, and retreated a few paces, snorting in alarm. She turned. The Duke was standing 10 feet away, his face a mask of thunderous disbelief. His sea-grey eyes were blazing. Beside him stood the head groom, his mouth agape. They had seen. They had seen it all. The Duke strode forward until he was standing right in front of her. He was radiating a cold fury. "Have you lost your senses? That animal could have killed you." Helena lifted her chin. The brief warmth she had felt was gone, replaced by a familiar, stubborn resolve. She would not be cowed. "He was not going to hurt me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He is a vicious, unpredictable beast. The grooms can barely handle him. And you, a stranger, think you can simply walk up and touch him?" His words were clipped, each one a shard of ice. "He is not vicious," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "He is lonely, and he is grieving." The Duke froze. The fury in his eyes was momentarily eclipsed by something else. Shock, and a flicker of that raw pain she had seen on her first day. He stared at her as if she had struck him. The word grieving hung in the air between them, a charged and dangerous thing. He seemed to search for a reply, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came. He looked from her face to the horse, who was watching them with anxious eyes, and then back to her. The anger had not vanished, but it had been complicated by a startling new element. Confusion. "Stay away from the horse, Your Grace," he said finally, his voice tight and controlled once more. "That is an order." He turned on his heel and strode back towards the house, his long, angry strides eating up the ground. He did not look back. Helena watched him go, her heart pounding. She had defied him. She had spoken a truth he did not want to hear. And in doing so, she had, for the first time, become visible. He had seen her, really seen her. And she was not sure if that was a victory or a catastrophe. She did not obey his order. The next day, she returned to the paddock. It felt like an act of defiance, a claiming of the one small piece of this world that felt like hers. She expected to be stopped, to be reprimanded. But no one came. Chaos greeted her with a low, welcoming nicker. He came to the wall immediately, resting his head on the stone, waiting for her touch. She stroked his face, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice. Here, with this broken creature, she did not have to be a duchess. She did not have to be a bartered bride. She could simply be Helena. She felt eyes on her and looked up towards the house. In one of the tall windows of the library, a figure stood watching. The Duke. A dark silhouette against the glass. He was too far away for her to read his expression, but she knew he was there. He was watching her break his command, and he was doing nothing. This became their new, unspoken dynamic. She would visit the horse, and he would watch from the library window. A silent, distant observation. The long, cold dinners continued, the formal, empty greetings in the corridors. But something had changed. The silence was no longer entirely vacant. It was now filled with his awareness of her. A week later, a new element arrived to disrupt their fragile, strange equilibrium. A carriage, far grander than the one that had brought Helena, swept up the drive. It was a high-perch phaeton of gleaming black lacquer and brilliant yellow wheels, driven by a lady with a fashionable, feather-plumed hat. Helena watched from her sitting-room window as the lady handed the reins to a groom with an air of careless authority and swept towards the front door. She was beautiful, even from a distance, with a confidence that seemed to radiate from her. A few minutes later, Hemlock appeared at her door. "Lady Sabine Finch has called, Your Grace. She is in the drawing-room." The name was vaguely familiar. She had heard the maids whispering it. A neighbour, a frequent visitor before. Helena smoothed her plain brown day dress and went downstairs. She entered the drawing-room to find the visitor standing before the fireplace as if she owned it. Lady Sabine was a vision of London fashion. Her gown was a vibrant sapphire blue, exquisitely cut, her blonde hair arranged in an elaborate cascade of curls. She turned as Helena entered, a bright, assessing smile on her perfectly painted lips. "Your Grace," she said, her voice as smooth and sweet as honey. She executed a flawless, graceful curtsy. "Sabine Finch, we are neighbours. I simply had to come and offer my welcome. We were all so surprised to hear of the Duke's sudden marriage." The word surprised was laden with meaning. It meant shocked. It meant appalled. "Lady Sabine," Helena replied, her voice even. "How kind of you to call." "Oh, it is my pleasure. Ravensdale has been so dreadfully grim these past months. We have all been so worried for Marcus." She used his given name with a casual intimacy that was clearly designed to sting. He has shut himself away entirely. It is a relief to know he will have some company. Her eyes swept over Helena's simple dress, her unadorned hair, her quiet demeanour. The look was dismissive, pitying. It was the look of a woman who had expected to be the Duchess of Blackwood, and was now faced with this pale, unnotable replacement. "It is a large house," Helena said, refusing to be drawn. Sabine's smile tightened. Indeed, and so difficult to manage without the proper experience. My mother always said the running of an estate like Ravensdale requires a very particular hand. She let the insinuation hang in the air. But I am sure you will learn. Eventually. The Duke entered then, and Sabine's entire demeanour shifted. Her smile became warmer, more genuine. She moved towards him, placing a familiar hand on his arm. Marcus, darling, I was just welcoming your bride. The Duke's face was impassive. He gently but firmly removed his arm from her grasp. Sabine, I was not aware we were expecting you. The rebuke was subtle, but clear. Sabine laughed, a tinkling, artificial sound. Oh, don't be such a hermit. I will not allow you to hide from all your old friends. We are having a small gathering at Finchley Park on Saturday. You must both come. It will do you a world of good to be in society again. It was not an invitation. It was a summons, a challenge. We are not entertaining at present, the Duke said, his voice flat. Nonsense, Sabine trilled. It is settled. I will expect you both. Now, she said, turning her bright, malicious gaze back to Helena. Tell me, Your Grace, what do you do to occupy your time in this dreary place? I hear you have taken up a rather rustic new hobby, befriending the stable beasts. The cruelty was so polished, so pleasant, that it was almost admirable. Helena felt a flush of anger, but she kept her voice calm. I enjoy the outdoors, Lady Sabine. So I have heard, Sabine said, her eyes glittering. You must be careful. That black stallion, it killed poor Edward, you know, or as good as. Threw him right at the old stone wall. It is a monster. I am surprised Marcus has not had it put down. At the mention of his brother, the Duke's face became a mask of stone. A muscle jumped in his jaw. That is enough, Sabine. I am only speaking the truth, darling, she said, feigning innocence. Out of concern for her Grace. The visit did not last much longer, but Sabine had accomplished her mission. She had established her territory, flaunted her intimacy with the Duke, and planted her sharp little barbs deep into Helena's composure. When she was gone, the silence she left behind was heavy with her cloying perfume and unspoken tensions. You will not be required to attend the gathering at Finchley Park, the Duke said, his back to her. I will send my regrets. Thank you, Helena said quietly. He left the room without another word. Helena stood alone in the vast drawing room, feeling the sting of Sabine's casual cruelty. She had been dismissed, weighed, and found wanting. It was a familiar feeling, but it had never felt quite so sharp. That evening, a carriage arrived bearing not a malicious society beauty, but an ally. Lady Lavinia, the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood, Marcus's great-aunt, swept into Ravensdale like a cleansing storm. She was a woman in her late 70s, small and bird-like, with eyes as bright and sharp as a hawk's. She took one look at the cold, silent hall, another at Helena's pale face, and a third at her nephew's grim expression, and made a small sound of disapproval. Good heavens, Marcus, she declared, her voice surprisingly robust. This house feels like a tomb, and you look like its chief mourner. It has been 6 months. Edward would not have wanted this. She turned to Helena, and her sharp eyes softened just a little. And you must be Helena. Come here, child. Helena approached, and the old woman took her hands. Her fingers were bony, but surprisingly warm. A pretty thing, but you are too pale, and that dress is entirely the wrong color for you. We will need to see to that. I am Lavinia." Over the next few days, Lady Lavinia's presence began to subtly alter the atmosphere of the house. She insisted on fires being built up in every room. She had the dust covers removed from the furniture in the drawing room. She ordered Hemlock to use the smaller, more intimate dining parlour for their meals, declaring she would not shout down the length of that absurd banqueting table. She talked. At dinner, she filled the silence with stories, with sharp observations, with questions that demanded answers. She drew Helena out, asking about her family, her upbringing, her interests. And she prodded at Marcus, chipping away at his silent reserve, with a persistence that he could not entirely ignore. One afternoon, she found Helena in her sitting room, staring out at the rain-lashed gardens. "He is watching you, you know," Lavinia said, settling into a chair opposite her. Helena started. "Who?" "Marcus. He watches you when you go out on your walks. He watches you with that horse." Helena said nothing. "That horse was Edward's," Lavinia continued softly. "Edward adored that animal. He was the only one who could handle him. After the boy died, the horse became wild with grief, just like his master." She paused, her gaze keen. "And now you, a quiet girl they all dismissed, and the horse lowers its head to you. It is a thing of note, Helena. Do not underestimate it." Lavinia's words were a comfort, a small point of warmth in the cold. But they were also a warning. She was becoming a person of note in a house that preferred ghosts. "We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." The Duke did not countermand his great-aunt's changes. He seemed to retreat even further into himself, a silent observer in his own home. But Helena noticed small things. One evening, she went to the library, seeking a book, and found a roaring fire lit in the hearth, the room warm and welcoming for the first time. The Duke was there, seated in a worn leather armchair, a ledger open on his lap. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment their eyes met. He did not speak, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod towards the shelves. Permission? Invitation? She found a book of poetry and settled in a chair on the opposite side of the hearth. They sat there for over an hour, in a silence that was, for the very first time, not oppressive. It was a shared, companionable quiet, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the turning of pages. It was a fragile truce. Inspired by Lavinia's small rebellions, Helena began her own. She asked the gardener, a taciturn man named Thomas, for flowers from the greenhouses. She began arranging them in vases, bringing small bursts of colour and life into the grey rooms. At first, the staff watched her with suspicion, but when the Duke made no comment, they slowly began to unbend. The maid, Agnes, even offered a shy smile one morning. Helena found she knew the rhythms of the house. She knew that Mrs. Graves, the cook, was in the kitchens by 5 each morning, that Hemlock polished the silver every Tuesday, that the grooms muttered about chaos, but left him fresh hay and water with a reluctant diligence. She was learning the geography of her prison, and in doing so, making it a little more like a home. Her daily visits to chaos were the anchor of her existence. The bond between them deepened into a quiet, trusting friendship. She discovered he loved apples, and she would bring one from the kitchen every day, feeding it to him in careful slices from her palm. She would talk to him, telling him about her day, about the cold house and the silent duke and the sharp-eyed old lady who was her unlikely ally. The horse would listen, his dark eyes soft, his head often resting on her shoulder. He was her confidant, her only real friend. One afternoon, as she was leaving the paddock, she saw that the gate was not properly latched. The heavy iron bolt was drawn back, resting on the outside of the catch. A gust of wind could blow it open. She frowned. The grooms were always so careful. She slid the bolt firmly home, the sound of the metal clanging loud in the quiet air. It was strange, an oversight. 2 days later, it happened again. This time, the gate was slightly ajar. Chaos was standing near the opening, looking out, but had made no move to leave. A cold knot of suspicion formed in Helena's stomach. This was not an accident. She said nothing to anyone. She simply made sure the gate was secure before she left. The following week, Lady Sabine Finch called again. This time, she did not wait to be announced, but came upon Helena in the hall as she was returning from her walk. "Your Grace," Sabine said, her smile all teeth. "Still indulging in your stable-boy pursuits, I see. Your gown is quite earthy." Helena ignored the jibe. "Lady Sabine, I trust you are well." "Oh, I am always well," Sabine replied breezily. She lowered her voice to a confidential whisper. "I came to see Marcus, of course. He's been so low. I thought I might be able to cheer him. We were always so close, you know. Before... She gestured vaguely, a gesture that encompassed both Edward's death and Helena's arrival. "His Grace is in his study," Helena said, her tone cool. "Yes, I know." Sabine's eyes glittered with triumph. "He is expecting me." It was a lie, Helena was almost certain, but she could not challenge it. She watched as Sabine swept past her and headed for the West Wing, towards the Duke's private domain. The scent of her heavy, floral perfume lingered in the air like a poison. Helena felt a pang of something she could not name. It was not jealousy. It was a kind of protective anger. Sabine was a vulture, circling, waiting for the house and its master to fall. An hour later, a commotion erupted from outside. Shouts from the direction of the stables. The sound of a horse neighing in panic. Helena ran to the window. Her heart leaped into her throat. Chaos was out. The black stallion was galloping across the lawn towards the formal gardens, his eyes wild, his tail high. Grooms were running after him, shouting, waving their arms, which only made him more frantic. Without a second thought, Helena ran from the room, down the great staircase, and out the front door. She ignored Hemlock's cry of alarm. "Stay back," she called to the grooms. "You are frightening him." She walked calmly onto the lawn, into the path of the panicked horse. He was thundering towards her, a terrifying mass of black muscle. The grooms scattered. "Chaos," she said, her voice low and steady. "Chaos, it's me." The stallion was nearly upon her. He swerved at the last second, his hooves tearing up the turf. He circled her, snorting, his body trembling. "It's all right," she murmured, standing her ground, making no sudden moves. "It's all right now. You are safe." She held out a hand. She did not move towards him. She waited. He circled her again, his pace slowing. He stopped, his chest heaving. He looked at her, the panic in his eyes slowly receding. He knew her. She was the calm presence from the paddock wall. She was the voice that hummed. She was the hand that offered apples. He took a hesitant step towards her. then another. He lowered his head and nudged her outstretched hand. A wave of relief so profound it made her dizzy washed over Helena. She took hold of his forelock gently. "Come on, boy," she whispered. "Let's go home." Slowly, she began to walk him back towards the distant paddock. The grooms watched in stunned silence. As she reached the paddock, she saw the gate swinging wide open. The bolt was not just unlatched. It was broken. The metal housing had been smashed, as if struck by a heavy stone. This was no accident. It was deliberate. Sabotage. And then she saw the Duke standing by the stable block. He had come out to see what the commotion was. With him was Lady Sabine, a look of thwarted fury on her beautiful face. Marcus's gaze was fixed on the broken latch, and then on Sabine. His expression was colder and harder than she had ever seen it. He said something to Sabine, his voice too low for Helena to hear. Sabine's face went pale. She turned and practically ran to her waiting carriage, climbing in without waiting for the footman. The phaeton tore down the drive and was gone. The Duke walked over to Helena, who was now standing inside the paddock with Chaos, stroking the horse's neck. His sea-grey eyes were unreadable. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice tight. "No, Your Grace. We are both unharmed." He looked at her plain dress now stained with mud, at her calm hand on the neck of the supposedly untamable beast. He looked at her as if seeing a completely new person. "You saved him," he said. It was not a question. "He just needed someone to be calm," she replied simply. He nodded slowly. He reached out and ran a hand down the stallion's powerful shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. It was the first time she had seen him touch the horse. "I am glad you were not harmed," he said, his voice stiff with unspent emotion. He turned and walked away, back to the cold, silent house. But this time, the silence he left behind felt different. It felt like the quiet after a storm. The incident with Chaos changed something fundamental in the house. The Duke began to seek Helena's company, not just in the shared silence of the library, but in quiet, hesitant conversation. He asked her to walk with him one afternoon, not in the formal gardens, but up on the fells, where the wind was sharp and the view stretched for miles. They walked for a long time without speaking, the only sound their boots on the rough track and the cry of a distant bird. The landscape was vast and empty, and in its emptiness there was space to breathe. "Sabine Finch will not be calling again," he said abruptly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Helena glanced at him. His profile was stark against the grey sky. "I see." She admitted to breaking the latch. She thought the horse would run off, or that it would harm you, forcing me to have it put down. He spoke the words with a quiet, bitter disgust. "Why would she do that?" Helena asked, though she knew the answer. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Because she believed she was to be the next Duchess of Blackwood. She saw you as an interloper." "And am I not?" Helena asked, her voice soft. A strange expression crossed his face. He looked at her for a long moment, at her wind-whipped hair and her clear, steady eyes. "No," he said, the word quiet but firm. "You are not." He began to talk then, in short, halting sentences. He spoke of the estate, of the tenant farms, of the struggles of the last few years. He did not speak of his brother, not yet. But he was opening a door, just a crack, into his world. And he was inviting her in. A few evenings later, in the library, He looked up from his book and spoke into the quiet. Edward chose his name. Helena lowered her own book. His name? Chaos, the Duke clarified. The Stallion. The breeder called him Midnight Sun. Edward said it was sentimental nonsense. He said the horse had a storm in its heart. He called him Chaos. He smiled. It was not a real smile. The almost of a smile, a brief, painful flicker of memory at the corner of his mouth. My father was appalled, but Edward always had his own way of seeing things. It was the most he had ever said about his brother. It was a gift, a small, fragile offering of his grief. He sounds like he was a remarkable young man, Helena said softly. The almost smile vanished. He was reckless, the Duke said, the familiar shield of coldness snapping back into place. And it cost him his life. He closed his book with a quiet finality, ending the conversation. But the door, once opened, could not be entirely shut. Helena felt a deep, compelling need to understand. To understand the silent, grieving man who was her husband, and the ghost of the brother who haunted every corner of Ravensdale. One night, unable to sleep, she went down to the library. A storm was raging outside, the wind howling around the corners of the house, rattling the window panes. The room was dark, save for the dying embers of the fire. She did not light a lamp. She stood by the window, watching the trees thrash in the darkness. Her gaze fell upon the Duke's desk. It was a massive mahogany piece, its surface neat and ordered. On a sudden impulse, she walked over to it. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was just drawn to this center of his solitary world. She ran her fingers over the cool, polished wood. Her hand brushed against a small, carved rosette on the side of the pedestal. It felt loose. Curious, she pressed it. There was a soft click. A narrow, vertical panel slid open, revealing not a drawer, but the edge of one. A secret compartment. Her heart began to beat faster. This was a trespass, a violation of his privacy. She should close it and walk away. She could not. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the drawer open. It was not large. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a single object. A small, leather-bound journal. The initials E.B., Edward Blackwood, were embossed in faded gold on the cover. She stared at it for a long time. The wind howled. The house groaned. It felt as if the entire world was telling her to stop. Reading this felt like a betrayal far greater than their transactional marriage. It was a betrayal of the fragile trust that was beginning to grow between them. But her need to understand was stronger. To understand the brother was to understand the Duke. To understand the grief was to understand the man. With a deep breath, she lifted the journal from the drawer. She took it to the armchair by the dying fire and opened it. The handwriting was a bold, energetic scrawl, so different from the Duke's precise script. She began to read. The journal was not a record of recklessness. It was the opposite. It was a record of sensitivity, of poetry, of a young man who felt things with a painful intensity. He wrote of his love for the wild fells, for music, for his horse, Chaos, whom he called his dark confidant. He wrote of the pressure he felt to be a Blackwood, bold, fearless, a sportsman. He wrote of his admiration for his older brother, Marcus, but also of his fear of being a disappointment, of living in his shadow. Helena's hands grew cold as she read on. The entries from the final weeks of his life were filled with a growing anxiety. His friends were planning a reckless steeplechase across the fells. There was a particularly dangerous jump over a collapsed section of stone wall. They were all daring each other to take it. Edward did not want to. He described the jump in detail, the poor takeoff, the treacherous landing. He called it a fool's errand. The final entry was dated the morning of his death. They are all going. Marcus is away in London, thank God. He would try to stop me, and I would feel a coward. But I feel a coward for going. Charles and Peter are calling me out. They say chaos can clear anything. But it is not the horse I doubt. It is the jump. It is my own nerve. I cannot show them I am afraid. A Blackwood is never afraid. I wish I could be someone else, just for today. Helena closed the journal. The room was utterly silent, save for the beating of her own heart. A profound, aching sadness washed over her. Edward Blackwood had not been a reckless boy courting danger. He had been a sensitive, frightened young man who had died because he was too afraid to admit his fear. Marcus was grieving a man who had never existed. He was honoring a myth of reckless bravado, while the true, gentle boy was lost, misunderstood even in death. And the Duke's grief, his guilt, was tangled up in this false narrative. He had not seen his brother, not the real him. A floorboard creaked in the hall. Helena's head snapped up. Her blood ran cold. The library door opened. The Duke stood on the threshold, a lamp in his hand. The light cast long, dancing shadows, throwing his face into sharp relief. His eyes went from her face to the open secret drawer, to the journal clutched in her hands. His face, which had been slowly softening over the past weeks, became a mask of ice. The sea grey of his eyes turned to stone. The air in the room became thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. "What?" he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Have you done?" He strode into the room, setting the lamp down on a table with a thud. The light flared, illuminating the fury and a deep, wounded betrayal in his eyes. He did not shout. He did not need to. The cold rage emanating from him was more terrifying than any outburst. "You had no right," he said, his voice shaking with a suppressed violence. That was private. That was his. Helena rose to her feet, the journal still in her hand. Her own heart was pounding, but her resolve was like steel. She would not cower. Not now. "I know," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "It was a violation, and I will not ask for your forgiveness for it." His eyes narrowed. "You will leave this room. You will go to your own, and in the morning we will discuss the arrangements for your departure." It was over. He was sending her away. The fragile world she had begun to build was shattering around her, but she did not move. "No," she said. He looked at her as if she had sprouted a second head. Disbelief warred with his anger. "What did you say?" "I said no," she repeated, taking a step towards him. "You can send me away tomorrow. You can dissolve this marriage and cast me out. But tonight, you will listen to me." She held up the journal. "You have spent 6 months grieving a lie. You have wrapped yourself in this story of a reckless, fearless brother who died living the life he chose. You have honored him by becoming a ghost, by turning this house into a tomb, by punishing yourself and his horse for a death you think was his fault. Do not speak of what you do not understand." He gritted out, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I understand more than you think," she shot back, her voice rising with a passion that surprised them both. "I understand that your brother was not fearless. He was terrified. He died because he was too afraid of disappointing you, of failing to be the Blackwood you all expected him to be. He died of a broken heart long before he reached that wall." She took another step, closing the distance between them until she was standing directly before him. She could feel the heat of his anger, the rigid wall of his control. "You are not grieving Edward," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, intense whisper. "You are grieving the man you thought he was, the man you wanted him to be. And in doing so, you are betraying the memory of the gentle, sensitive, frightened boy he truly was. The boy who loved music and poetry. The boy who called his horse his dark confidant." She saw it then. The crack in the ice. A tremor that ran through him. His control, so absolute, so unyielding, was fracturing. "Stop," he whispered, the word ragged, broken. "You see his recklessness in chaos," she pressed on, relentless. "But I see his fear, his loneliness, his grief. That is why he comes to me. I do not try to tame him. I just see him, the way you should have seen your brother." That was the final blow. A choked, guttural sound was torn from his throat. The stone mask crumbled, and what was left was a raw, agonizing grief that was terrible to behold. He staggered back a step, his hand coming up to cover his mouth. His sea-grey eyes, which had been so cold, were now flooded with a pain so profound it stole her breath. He did not weep, but the desolation on his face was worse than any tears. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not anger, but a shattered, dawning horror. The horror of a truth too long denied. Without another word, he turned and fled the room, leaving her alone with the journal, the dying fire, and the howling of the wind. The silence that descended was the silence of utter devastation. For 3 days, the house was colder and more silent than it had been upon her arrival. The Duke was a ghost again, but a different kind. Before, his presence had been a cold weight. Now, it was a gaping absence. He did not appear for meals. He did not ride out. The light in his study remained unlit. Hemlock reported, his face grim, that His Grace was not seeing anyone. Helena moved through the days in a fog of uncertainty. She had spoken the truth, a truth she believed he needed to hear, but she had wielded it like a weapon. She had shattered him. The small, fragile world they had begun to build lay in ruins. She expected a summons at any moment. A cold, formal note from his solicitor. The end? She continued her routines. It was all she knew how to do. She arranged the flowers. She walked the grounds. And she visited chaos. The great horse seemed to feel the oppressive mood of the house. He was listless, resting his head on her shoulder, with a deep, weary sigh. She would stand with him for hours, her hand on his warm neck, drawing comfort from his solid, living presence. She was waiting. On the 3rd afternoon, as she was returning from the paddock, she saw a familiar, gleaming phaeton making its way up the drive. Sabine Finch. A cold dread settled in Helena's stomach. What was she doing here? Marcus had banished her. Helena entered the house just as Sabine was handing her cloak to a reluctant footman. Sabine's face lit up with a malicious, triumphant smile when she saw Helena. "Your Grace," she purred. "Just the person. I was afraid I would have to have you fetched from the stables." "Lady Sabine," Helena said, her voice devoid of expression. I believe you were told not to return to Ravensdale." "Oh, that." Sabine waved a dismissive hand. "A misunderstanding." Marcus was overwrought. He has since come to his senses. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "In fact, that is why I am here. He sent for me. He has finally made his decision. About this unfortunate arrangement." Helena stood her ground, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. "He is ending it, of course," Sabine continued, her eyes glittering. "The marriage. It was a mistake from the start, a madness born of grief. He is making arrangements for an annulment. He asked me to help ease the transition, to convey the news to you gently. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. But the Duke had been hidden away for 3 days. What had he been doing? What had he decided in his solitude and his pain? "He wants you gone by the end of the week," Sabine said, delivering the final, killing blow. "He told me himself. He said he cannot bear the sight of you, that your presence here is a constant, painful reminder of his failure." Helena did not flinch. She did not cry. She met Sabine's triumphant gaze with a quiet, unyielding dignity. She did not believe her. And yet a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced her. "If the Duke has a message for me," Helena said, her voice level, "he can deliver it himself." "He will not," Sabine said with a cruel little smile. "He cannot face you. But do not worry. I will be here to take your place. Ravensdale needs a true duchess." "That will not be necessary." The voice came from the top of the grand staircase. Both women looked up. Marcus was standing there, dressed not in his perpetual black, but in a dark blue coat. He looked pale, and there were dark shadows under his eyes, but he was calm. The storm in his eyes had passed, leaving a quiet, deep clarity. He descended the stairs slowly, his gaze fixed not on Sabine, but on Helena. Sabine rushed towards the bottom of the stairs, her face wreathed in a welcoming smile. "Marcus, darling, I was just explaining the situation to her, as you asked." He did not stop to look at her. He walked past her as if she were a piece of furniture and stopped directly in front of Helena. He looked down at her, his expression one she had never seen before. It was open, vulnerable, and filled with a quiet, aching regret. He heard Sabine's claims. He saw the flicker of uncertainty she had managed to plant in Helena's eyes. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon Sabine. "Lady Sabine," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the finality of a death sentence. "You will leave my house, and you will never, under any circumstances, set foot on Ravensdale land again. If you do, I will instruct my men to remove you as a common trespasser. Is that understood?" Sabine's jaw dropped. Her face, a moment ago so triumphant, crumpled into a mask of disbelief and fury. "Marcus, you sent for me. You said—" "I said nothing," he cut her off, his voice like ice. "You have preyed on my grief and tormented my wife. Now get out." Sabine stared at him, then at Helena's calm, still face. With a strangled cry of pure rage, she turned and fled, snatching her cloak from the stunned footman and running from the house. The slam of the great oak door echoed in the hall. Silence. Marcus turned back to Helena. The silence stretched. 1 second. 2. He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warm, his grip firm and sure. "Helena," he said. It was the first time he had ever said her name. Just her name. It was a prayer, an apology. A beginning. My wife, he said, his voice low and earnest. Will you walk with me? She could only nod, her throat tight with an emotion she could not name. He kept hold of her hand, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles, and led her out of the cold house and into the pale afternoon light. They did not speak as they walked, their path taking them instinctively towards the far paddock. Chaos saw them coming and trotted to the wall, nickering a soft welcome. They stopped, their joined hands resting on the cold stone. I have been a blind fool, Marcus said, his gaze on the horse. For 6 months, I have been mourning a ghost of my own creation, a hero, a reckless Blackwood, because it was easier than admitting the truth. He turned to her, his sea-grey eyes filled with a profound, humbling sorrow. It was easier than admitting that I failed him. I was his older brother. I should have seen his fear. I should have protected him. But I was too busy being the Duke of Blackwood. I pushed him, just as everyone else did, to be something he was not. He looked down at their hands. You saw him. In the journal. In the horse. You saw the real Edward. You saw him with a clarity I never had. He lifted his gaze back to her face. And you saw me. You have seen past the cold, grieving shell I made of myself. You stood in that library and held a mirror up to me, and you forced me to look. It was the cruelest, kindest thing anyone has ever done. A tear traced a path down her cheek, and she did not bother to wipe it away. I did not ask for a wife, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I signed a contract for a duchess, a functionary, but I did not get what I bargained for. I got you, a woman of quiet courage and fierce integrity, a woman who could see the truth in a grieving horse. He released her hand, only to gently cup her face. You did not tame chaos, Helena. You listened to him. You gave him a space to be seen for what he was. And in doing so, you did the same for me. He searched her eyes. The contract between us is a piece of paper, a transaction. I want to tear it up, and I want to ask you, not as a duke to a commoner, but as a man to a woman. Will you stay? Will you choose to be my wife? Will you help me bring this house and its master back to life? It was not a demand. It was a plea. He was giving her back the choice that had been stolen from her. The choice to leave. The choice to stay. She looked at this man, his pride stripped away, his heart laid bare. She looked at the wild, beautiful horse who had been her first friend. She looked at the bleak, grey landscape that was beginning to feel like home. Yes, she whispered. Marcus, yes. The smile that finally broke across his face was a true smile. It reached his eyes, transforming his severe features, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long, hard winter. And in that moment, Helena knew she had not just found a home. She had found her heart. The spring that came to Ravensdale that year was a revelation. It was as if the land itself, freed from the oppressive grief of the house, could finally exhale. Daffodils bloomed in great golden swathes across the parkland. The skeletal trees of the woods cloaked themselves in a haze of vibrant green. The air was soft, filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. Inside the house, the transformation was just as profound. The rooms were filled with light and air. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, and the windows were thrown open to the gentle breeze. The sound of conversation and even, on occasion, laughter echoed in the halls that had once held only silence. Helena, with Lady Lavinia as her enthusiastic co-conspirator, had breathed life back into the stone. The gardens were being replanted, not with severe formal beds, but with a joyful tangle of roses and lavender. The long dining table had been moved to storage, and they took their meals in the sunny parlour, their chairs close together. Marcus had changed most of all. The cold, remote Duke was gone, replaced by a man who was quiet, yes, but whose silence was now one of peaceful contemplation, not pain. He smiled often, a slow, warm smile that was almost always directed at his wife. He worked, managing the estate with a renewed purpose. But his evenings were for Helena. They would walk on the fells, which were now carpeted in purple heather, or sit together in the library, reading, their shoulders touching, a comfortable, established companionship between them. They spoke of Edward often, not with the raw, agonizing grief of before, but with a quiet, loving sadness. Marcus had shared the contents of the journal with Lady Lavinia, and together the three of them had mourned the gentle boy he truly was. The myth was gone, and in its place was the memory of a real, beloved brother. His portrait was moved from a dark corridor to a place of honor in the library, and it seemed to Helena that the sad eyes in the painting had finally found some peace. One bright May afternoon, Helena and Marcus stood by the familiar stone wall of the far paddock. Chaos trotted over to them, no longer a creature of frantic energy, but of serene power. He nudged Helena's hand, searching for the customary apple, then rested his great head on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus stroked the horse's neck, his expression gentle. "He's happy," Helena said softly. "We are all happy," Marcus replied, slipping his arm around her waist and drawing her close. "Because of you." He looked down at her, his sea-grey eyes clear and full of a deep, abiding love. "You came to Ravensdale, a stranger, a bride in a bargain. They all dismissed you. I dismissed you. And you saved us all, simply by being who you are." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. She was no longer the dismissed girl, the grey wren. She was Helena, Duchess of Blackwood, a wife, a partner, a woman who had been chosen, a woman who had chosen. She was, at last, truly and completely seen. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.